Imagine a barrier so immense, so hostile, that it seems to divide the very world in two. The Sahara Desert. Over 3.5 million square miles of shifting sand, scorching wind, and lethal heat. For centuries, this ocean of sand was thought to be impassable, a natural wall separating sub-Saharan Africa from the Mediterranean. But human greed and the drive for commerce found a way to bridge this deadly expanse. Beneath the blazing sun, columns of people and animals carved tracks into the dunes. They were the trade caravans carrying salt, gold, and another, far more precious cargo, human beings. While the transatlantic slave trade is rightfully remembered, another massive trafficking network operated in the shadow of the desert. It was the Trans-Saharan slave trade, a network that began centuries before European ships arrived on West Africa's shores. It was a system that transformed the Sahara from a barrier into a highway of human misery. This is the story of the longest-running, most grueling slave trade in human history. The engine of this trade was an animal not native to Africa, the camel. Introduced to the region around the 1st century CE, the camel revolutionized desert travel. These creatures could walk for 10 days without water, carrying heavy loads across treacherous terrain. Soon, merchants organized caravans of staggering size, sometimes consisting of thousands of camels. These massive convoys followed precise routes, connecting trading hubs like Timbuktu and Gao to the Mediterranean coast. The merchants traded Mediterranean manufactured goods, textiles, and salt mined in the desert. In return, they sought the gold of West Africa, ivory, and captive human beings. The captives were forced to walk alongside the caravans, chained together to prevent escape. The caravans moved slowly, navigating by the stars, sand dunes, and the rare, life-saving oases. Every journey was a calculated gamble, where a dry well or a sandstorm meant death for everyone. To understand the trans-Saharan trade, we must look at its sheer longevity. While the transatlantic trade lasted roughly 400 years, the Saharan trade operated for over 12 centuries. It began with the expansion of Islamic empires in the 8th century and persisted into the early 20th century. Because it occurred over such a vast time frame, documenting the total scale is extremely difficult. However, modern historians estimate that between 7 and 10 million Africans were trafficked across the desert. Every year, thousands of men, women, and children were captured in raids and wars in the African interior. They were marched north, sold from one trader to another in a chain of transactions. This steady, relentless drain of humanity reshaped the demographics of West and Central Africa. Yet, the scale of this trade remains largely invisible in global historical consciousness. The desert sands have covered the tracks of millions who were marched into oblivion. The journey across the Sahara was a test of survival that many did not pass. Captives were forced to march on foot for weeks, covering over 1,000 miles of burning sand. They walked barefoot under a merciless sun, carrying heavy loads with little water and minimal food. Those who slowed down due to exhaustion, illness, or injury were ruthlessly abandoned. To stop and help a falling captive meant risking the survival of the entire caravan. Consequently, the desert routes became littered with the bleached bones of those left behind. Historians estimate that the mortality rate during the crossing was at least 20%. This means that 1 out of every 5 captives died before even reaching the northern markets. The Sahara was not just a road, it was a vast, open-air graveyard. For the survivors, the psychological trauma of seeing their companions die was as devastating as the physical torment. For those who survived the desert crossing, the end of the journey brought them to the bustling markets of North Africa. Cities like Cairo, Tripoli, Tunis, and Marrakesh were the primary hubs of the trade. In these crowded, sun-drenched markets, captives were washed, oiled, and displayed like cattle. Wealthy buyers inspected their teeth, eyes, and bodies, bargaining over prices. Cairo, in particular, was a massive market where thousands of enslaved people were sold annually. From these coastal hubs, many captives were shipped across the Mediterranean to the Ottoman Empire, Italy, and Spain. Others were sent east to the Middle East, serving in households, palaces, and agricultural fields. The transition from the rural interior of West Africa to these cosmopolitan cities was jarring. They were now property in a foreign land, speaking foreign languages and serving foreign masters. Their labor built the palaces, cultivated the gardens, and staffed the households of the Mediterranean elite. One of the most horrific aspects of the Trans-Saharan slave trade was the treatment of male captives. Many male slaves were destined to become eunuchs, serving as guardians of harems and administrators in royal courts. To supply this demand, young boys underwent full castration, a procedure of extreme brutality. Because Islamic law prohibited castration within the empire, the surgeries were often performed at border stations. The operation was performed without anesthesia, using crude instruments and hot oil or ash to stop the bleeding. Due to infection, shock, and blood loss, the mortality rate for this procedure was catastrophic. It is estimated that up to 80 or 90% of the boys who underwent castration died as a result. This high death rate meant that for every surviving eunuch, multiple boys had perished in agony. Furthermore, this practice had a profound demographic impact, preventing enslaved populations from reproducing. Unlike in the Americas, there was no self-sustaining population of enslaved descendants in the North African markets. When comparing the Trans-Saharan trade to the transatlantic trade, striking differences emerge. The transatlantic trade was highly industrialized, driven by plantation agriculture and corporate monopolies. The Trans-Saharan trade, by contrast, was decentralized, managed by family networks and independent merchants. While the transatlantic trade lasted 4 centuries and moved 12 million people, the Saharan trade moved similar numbers over 12 centuries. The Atlantic trade focused heavily on male labor for sugarcane and cotton plantations. The Saharan trade, however, prioritized female captives for domestic service and concubinage. In the Americas, racial classifications became rigid, permanent, and hereditary. In the Islamic Mediterranean, slavery was not legally race-based, and manumission was more common. Yet, the lack of rigid racial laws did not make the Saharan trade any less brutal. Both systems reduced human beings to commodities, stripping them of their freedom, culture, and families. If you believe that exposing these hidden chapters of history is important, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Your support helps Unshackled History bring these stories to light. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on how this trade shaped the global history of slavery. While many captives were sent to the coast, some met a far worse fate in the heart of the desert. Taghaza, a desolate salt-crusted depression in northern Mali where water was scarce and nothing grew. This was the site of the legendary Saharan salt mines, a vital source of wealth for West African empires. The work of mining the salt was performed entirely by enslaved laborers. The conditions were apocalyptic. Laborers lived in houses built entirely of salt blocks with salt-crusted roofs. The water they drank was brackish and salty, and the food, imported by caravans, was meager. The intense heat, dust, and labor of cutting heavy salt slabs destroyed the health of the workers. Blindness, respiratory diseases, and dehydration were universal among the mining population. Escape was impossible, as any runaway would quickly die of thirst in the surrounding dunes. Taghaza was a place of slow execution where human life was expendable, bought and sold for the very salt they mined. Unlike the transatlantic trade, the majority of captives in the Trans-Saharan trade were women. Historians estimate that 2/3 of the captives marched across the desert were female. They were highly sought after as domestic servants, agricultural laborers, and concubines. In the wealthy households of North Africa and the Middle East, female slaves were symbols of status and wealth. Many were forced into concubinage, their bodies owned entirely by their masters. Any children born to these women were legally free, which led to a gradual assimilation of their descendants. This assimilation, however, came at the cost of the women's original identities and freedom. They were isolated from their families and forced to adapt to a new culture, language, and religion. The high demand for women also meant that West African societies were drained of their reproductive capacity. The gender imbalance left behind in West Africa disrupted local economies and family structures for generations. The decline of the Trans-Saharan slave trade was slow, unfolding over the course of the 19th century. It was driven by a combination of internal changes and external pressures. European powers, particularly Great Britain and France, began pressuring North African states to abolish the trade. As French colonial rule expanded into West Africa and Algeria, they actively suppressed the caravan routes. The French military established outposts along the old trade paths, intercepting slave traders. Concurrently, local rulers in Tunis, Tripoli, and Morocco faced mounting economic and diplomatic pressure. Tunis officially abolished the slave trade in 1846, followed by similar decrees in other regions. However, the trade did not vanish overnight. It survived in secret, using remote desert routes to evade patrols. In some areas, such as Mauritania and southern Morocco, the trade persisted into the early 20th century. The end of the trade was not a single event, but a slow strangulation of a network that had operated for over a millennium. Today, the legacy of the Trans-Saharan slave trade is still visible, though rarely discussed openly. The descendants of the trade live in communities across North Africa, the Middle East, and Turkey. In many North African countries, people of sub-Saharan descent face systemic racism and social marginalization. The historical trauma is reflected in language, where derogatory terms for black people remain in use. In West Africa, the memory of the raids and the fear of the caravans still linger in local oral histories. The trade left deep divisions between the nomadic peoples of the desert and the agrarian societies of the south. Yet the history remains neglected, overshadowed by the memory of European colonization and the Atlantic trade. Understanding the Trans-Saharan trade is essential to grasping the full scope of global African history. Only by acknowledging this long-standing network can we begin to heal the wounds it left behind. It is a reminder that the desert sands hold many secrets, waiting to be uncovered. The story of the Trans-Saharan trade is a testament to both human cruelty and the resilience of those who survived. Thank you for watching this episode of Unshackled History. If you want to help us continue uncovering these forgotten histories, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Watch the next video on your screen to learn more about the histories they didn't teach you in school.